And I'd like to introduce first Timothy, who will be talking, kind of giving us a bird's eye view of the U.S. sanctions policy. Okay.
Thank you. Well, thank you everybody for coming. We will be talking about sanctions until you're tired of hearing about sanctions. Yet let me start with this question. Who are we as individuals? How do you see yourself as an individual, a spiritual person, a moral person? Who do we see ourselves as an American community? Who are we? I remember reading books about the Underground Railroad. And anyone can imagine that if we were a slave, we would be running. Easy to empathize with. More complicated were the free Americans at the time who took a risk and provided shelter. That's more complicated. You put yourself at risk. You put your family at risk, but for a moral position. I remember thinking the same question reading the Diary of Anne Frank. Yes, it's really easy for me to imagine that if I was a Jew living in Europe, I would be running as fast as Anne Frank's family was. The more complicated question is, what happens if we were Dutch, Christian? Would we open up our hearts? Would we open up our homes? Who are you? Who am I? Who are we as Americans? That's the foundational question as we talk about sanctions. So, I don't like sanctions. I really don't. I think that they retard diplomacy. I think that they front load controversy. I think they make military intervention more likely. Yet, they're a reality, and they're a geopolitical tool we are increasingly relying upon. And within this reality of sanctions, I started to export humanitarian goods to Iran. And it's a very complicated business to be involved in. And recently, starting in 2012, there was a sanctions event. I'll call it right now the straw that broke the camel's back. And in January of 2012, under executive order, we blacklisted the final important Iranian bank, Bank Tejarat. And at that moment, when we blacklisted them, we did not have a humanitarian exemption for the financial transactions necessary to trade in food and medicine. And immediately, my friends at pharmaceutical companies who must go unnamed, but these are publicly traded Fortune 100 pharmaceutical companies, were not able to get their cancer medicines to Iran, no matter what the Treasury Department says. I saw it firsthand. Companies who made medicine for hemophilia, their outside attorneys called me, asked me what to do. And I told them what to do, but I know that the hemophilia medicine could not get through to Iran. And particularly, this issue started to raise its head in March of 2012. And then if all you have to do is go Google hemophilia medicine Iran, and you will see the issue build. It was documented, and we caused this problem. And the problem still exists today. So what I would start as explaining is there's really two types of sanctions from America. One are legislatively enacted sanctions. Congress will come up with a bill, and the Senate will come up with a bill. Typically, people will tell you the congressional sanctions are much harsher, and in the way they are, because they do push the confrontational aspect of sanctions. Yet, ironically, they also have better humanitarian provisions. So they're more receptive to humanitarian carve-outs. Another type of sanctions are sanctions issued by the power of the president. They're called executive orders. And when the Treasury Department started to use both legislatively enacted sanctions, which require humanitarian transaction, but they implemented executive branch sanctions in a manner that did not exempt the necessary financial transactions. So the paradox arose. People were denied medicine. People were denied food in some circumstances. I remember, I think it was March of 2012, there was literally Panamax tankers of wheat that went to Iran and turned around. It's there. It's on the record. To talk about the financial transaction sanctions, imagine that you were to go to a local community bank, Third Community Bank of Toledo, Ohio, and you were going to send a wire transfer of cash to Switzerland. Obviously, this community bank does not have a direct relationship with the Swiss bank. It would have to necessarily clear through one of our international money banks. We know who they are: Bank of America, Citi, JP Morgan Chase, Bank of New York, HSBC, that's a British bank. Okay? So what we did is we left a few small Iranian community banks, and then we blacklisted all of their major international financial institutions. How does that small community bank actually clear its transactions? We've implicated the entire civilian banking infrastructure necessary for the people of Iran to access food, medicine, agricultural commodities, necessary for non-governmental organizations to send money to earthquake victims, to orphanages. But we haven't exempted it. And the president is legally required to exempt it. As applied, the executive order, as applied to humanitarian trade, is against the letter of the law. 22 U.S.C. 7202. The executive shall not impose any unilateral agricultural or medical sanctions unless United Nations Security Council. Well, out of the 13 banks blacklisted, only 3 of them are UNSCR designated. Or that the president presents the list to both houses of our legislature, House of Representatives and Senate, and it's voted upon. Is it too much work? They've never done that. And so we have this paradox that exists. And sometimes, as I have to get on another plane and do another exotic banking transaction, or go and talk to a banking regulator from a third country, or to tell my bankers, get off the ledge, don't jump, everything will be okay, I wonder, why am I doing this? Why don't I make another type of company? Why don't I take another type of business? And I arrive at that moment of saying, what would you do if you were the white citizen? What would you do if you were the Dutch family? And fortunately or unfortunately, I don't know what would happen. So I feel this responsibility. Are there any questions?